Hello and happy Thanksgiving. Yes, gobble gobble. Today we are going to, once again, if you haven't watched those three film clips above, yeah, hold off. Uh, if you are for whatever reason you don't like to see violent, that's an R-rated film. It's a very violent series of clips. It basically shows an ambush that is based on the real ambush of the expedition of James Braddock, William Braddock. I always get those confused. But anyway, early in the French and Indian War. But yeah, but it's also done very realistically, so watch it at your own peril. Um, it is basically, though, Last of the Mohicans is a fictitious story that occurs in the middle of the French and Indian War. Okay, now I want to show you a couple of other things too. Let's begin with this. Now, yesterday we were talking about um, the distribution of power and race in Central and South America. And I was talking about my wife, who I'm very proud of. I don't know why in the world she chose me, but this is my wife. And yes, that's my granddaughter. But my wife, as you can tell, she is, well, I don't know if you can tell, she's Colombian. Uh, you know, the different peoples of South America have all sorts of different ethnicities. For example, in Argentina, you find almost no remnants of Native Americans in Argentina. And I watched a documentary about this and found out that the Europeans who came there pretty much wiped them out. In places like Uruguay, you see a lot greater incidence of native indigenous species, native indigenous peoples who still live today. In Brazil, you have a large number of descendants of African slaves and Native Americans and Portuguese. But in Colombia and Venezuela, you find, my wife, like I told you yesterday, my wife has significant Native American ancestry. If you can, for example, and there are certain things about her. Like in 2018, we went to, and it was in the middle of July. We went to Washington D.C. to see the city, and so we're walking around, and you can only imagine in Washington D.C. it's rather hot, and so we went to Arlington Cemetery, and on Facebook I have a picture of the two of us. And I am sitting, well, the two of us are sitting there. I'm wearing a gray T-shirt, and I don't know what she's wearing, but my gray T-shirt is black, as this shirt I'm wearing now, because I was soaked to the bone with sweat from just sitting out. We watched the changing of the guard, and it was just so hot. My wife, though, fresh as a daisy, smiling like that. And and then of course, like I told you about the fact that she doesn't have any hair on her underarms, or she doesn't have to shave her legs. And there are other indigenous Native American features that she has if you look at them. And in Colombia, it makes a difference. You know, they really, Maria says they really like straight hair. They like it. They don't have it, and they spend a lot of time straightening their hair. Maria's hair is naturally curly. And then she comes up here and finds out curly hair is actually a nice thing to have. Well, in Colombia, they spend all kind of time straightening out their hair, so it'll. And also, blue eyes are valued, in Colombia. But she doesn't have any of those features. In fact, she used to get teased when she was a child about her Native American features and her curly hair, and it really bothered her. Um, but she's a beautiful woman. I don't know why. Trust me, I don't know why she married me either. So shut up. But yeah. So yeah, that's and so I will tell you that you better prepare for a short answer question on your test that shows, that pyramid I showed you yesterday, that thing's coming back to haunt you. So you better be familiar with the terminologies there. Okay. All right. So that's enough of that. And also last night I was watching a documentary about, once again, the lost slave owners, because I'm interested in this. And there was a British documentary about British slave owning, not anything to do with the United States. You have to remember that, once again, only 10% of the African populations went to North America. A much greater percent went to the Caribbean. 20% ended up in the Caribbean, and the rest going to Central and South America. A lot going to Brazil. And this documentary, though, was talking about the people who owned slaves. And it talked about this one gentleman, I remember, of course, a gentleman owning slaves, kind of a contradiction in terms. But the thing was, he himself was of African descent. Now, he was of mixed descent, but he lived in Barbados, and he was a slave owner. And it talked about the pleasure that this guy, and the meticulousness this guy took with punishing slaves. Because remember what I told you about that term, seasoned slaves? How, a seasoned slave was one who had basically been broken, like you'd break a steer to a halter, or a horse to a saddle. They had to basically be either beaten or intimidated into becoming cooperative. And he goes into great detail, this person does, of the things he would do. And it showed some of the implements that he used. And one of them, I had a problem with a slave who ran away. And one of them was that they took an ankle brace that went around his ankle, very heavy. But on each side of the ankle brace were spikes that went out like about this far. And so if a person tried to run with that, that heavy thing on, the intent was that the spike would slash the other leg. I mean, and it also showed a device for putting in the mouth so that the person couldn't say anything if the slave was like belligerent, like, I don't like being a slave, that kind of bad talk. But yeah, and this guy, and also then any slave that tried to run away, of course, the first time they were beaten, and then after the beating, he poured a combination of salt and pickle juice on the wound. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible thing. Horrible, But anyway, let's shift gears from slavery and talk about wars. And look how it begins there. Wars of this era were, for the most part, civilized. That's a contradiction term again, civilized. War is never civilized, however, but it was like the wars of the 18th century had rules. For example, there's a story of during the Napoleonic Wars, which come a little later, but it's the same genre. The Napoleonic Wars, where Lord Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, who ends up winning the Battle of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington, in between battles, is riding down the line with his own troops. And a soldier from the French side sees him and takes a shot at him, trying to kill him. And then that soldier's own officer starts beating him and apologizes to Lord Wellington, saying, "I'm sorry, monsieur, he's new and doesn't know the rules around here yet." And here's the other thing, though, and you need to make notes of these things, guys, because I'm not just sitting here to talk. That the idea of the wars of the 18th century was not so much to kill your opponent as to drive him from the field. And once you drive him from the field, it's over for now, at least, until the next confrontation. I mean, and the soldiers would march in lines, and the soldiers would, and they would. Part of that was because of the weaponry they had. I wish we were in here. We could talk about that. You have to remember that the soldiers of the Napoleonic Wars, all of them carried muskets, not rifles, muskets. You say, what's the difference? Well, a musket, if you ever do not do this, do not do this, don't do this, do not do this, don't you do this. And I don't own a gun, but don't do this. But if you were to look down the barrel of a gun today, you would see inside, shine a light, you could see inside the barrel, and inside the barrel are grooves that turn either counterclockwise or counterclockwise, but look, in the same direction, these grooves that spiral. Now, those grooves are called riflings. Well, a musket doesn't have riflings. A musket is like shooting an object down a smooth pipe. Now, for those of you who play baseball, perhaps you know what a knuckleball is in baseball. In baseball, a knuckleball is a ball that has no spin. A musket fires a knuckleball, a ball that doesn't have any spin. It's just still in the air as it advances forward. The problem is, as that ball advances forward, air is, has different densities here, and the density changes from one foot to another. And that ball, as it goes through the air, reaching air pockets of different densities, it starts doing this business right here. It starts moving. It literally does. Yeah, it literally does start moving. And, that's great if you're throwing a baseball and you don't want the batter to hit the ball. Or, and I used to coach soccer, if you're kicking the ball and you want the goalie to not be able to get a bead on it, that's great. But if you want to shoot somebody and hit them, it's not great. That is why during this era, soldiers would march literally shoulder to shoulder. And they would march up, and remember the saying, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes? That wasn't a myth. That was truth and reality. You would get up there and until, at a certain distance, and you would halt, and then you would level, and then you would fire. And the other people would do the same to you. And after you fired, you stand there and you take the 3 minutes, not 3 minutes. A good soldier could fire his gun 3 times in a minute. But you had the powder and the ball and the, tamping and the waiting and present. Oh yeah, and the other guy's shooting. But don't be worried. If the other guy shoots you, he's not going to hit you. He may hit the guy next to you on either side. Or his mini ball may take off into the stratosphere or bury itself into the ground. It happened all the time. And so the idea was to focus as much firepower as you could. You massed your soldiers and you marched them across the field. You got very close and then you fired. And good soldiers knew that, of course, it's easy for me to sit here and say that. Quite another for somebody to go out and do it while somebody may be 15 yards away. I think I've got another scam call. 15 yards away. Is taking a shot at you. A good soldier would just stand there because you know what? Whether or not you get hit is random chance. It really is. The idea of somebody seeing you and shooting you, it'd be a lucky shot. More likely that ball goes past you and hits somebody behind you. And so yeah, that's how battles went. And the other thing about battles that I hope you're still writing, is that during the wars of the 18th century, these large armies pretty much stayed away from towns and cities. Armies fought battles on battlefields. And when the battle was over, it was over. Everybody went back to their tent. You didn't pursue the enemy. The objective, once again, was not to kill the enemy, but to drive him from the field. In the process, you probably killed some of them too, but you want to drive them from the field. And once again, when the battle's over, when the war is over, it's over. Remember the old balance of power idea that today's enemy is tomorrow's friend, and that comes up a lot in the 18th century. Side switching, the diplomatic revolution, which is on your test, by the way. And so, yeah, as it says, and did not draw to a great extent the civilian populations into fray or suffering. When does that change? It probably changes in World War One. In World War One is the first war where civilian casualties outnumber casualties of soldiers. And that is by design in World War One. I mean, for example, one of the greatest battles of the 19th century was the Battle of Gettysburg. You had something like 160,000 soldiers in two armies combined for 3 days, pounding it out around a little town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And it was in and around the town. Here's a trivia question for you. Do you know how many civilian casualties there were in the Battle of Gettysburg? 160,000 soldiers exchanging lead and cannon fire for 3 days. Do you know how many civilian casualties there were? 1. The poor unlucky woman was in her house. She was making dinner, and a wayward musket ball slammed through the front door and hit her in the back of the head, dropped her dead. But 1. And that, they didn't intend to kill civilians. No. And that was the thing about these wars. They were, as it says, didn't draw civilians into the suffering. Okay. Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the War of Spanish Succession, gave the British, 30-year cento to furnish slaves to the Spanish. Look, somebody wrote the major terms of the Treaty of Utrecht as if they were going to be necessary. Philip, the grandson of Louis XIV, became the first Bourbon king of Spain. France and Spain were not united, but the big thing was Great Britain received Gibraltar, that little piece of territory at the southern edge of Spain that we talked about before, and an important little chunk of rock. And finally, Britain received this asiento, the right to sell slaves to the Spanish, for 20 years. Yeah, that was a major coup for the British. Why? Because slaves cost money, good money. I mean, I was watching that thing on slavery last night. Just so many shocking statistics. Like, for example, the number of slaves that were brought to Barbados. Barbados is a little island off the coast of the United States. And Barbados, they said, was the first slave society. Just about everybody there was slaves. And 336,000 slaves brought to Barbados. And you say, well, why such a big number, such a small place? Because they kept being worked to death. Yeah. Anyway. Oh, the average lifespan. Here it is. The average lifespan for a slave in Barbados, 7 years. Once they came to Barbados, the average lifespan was 7 years. Interesting. Oh, the British also received the right to send one ship each year to the trading fair at Portobello in the Caribbean. Caribbean port on the Panamanian coast. This, however, allowed British smugglers an inroad into the rich Spanish trade routes. During one such event, there was a fight, and a British captain named Robert Jenkins had his ear cut off, which later on, when he became a member of Parliament, he kept that jar in a jar of brandy and then shook it around, trying to get the British Parliament to declare war on Spain at some other time. In 1739, the British went to war with Spain, and this became the opening round of several European wars of balance that would engulf Europe until 1815. Once again, wars of balance, wars of the balance of power, wars that people often got into not because they believed in the cause or had personal involvement in the cause, but because they didn't want country A from becoming too strong. Balance of power. The War of Austrian Succession, prime example, began when Frederick II, seizing the province of Silesia, which we've already talked about before, in violation of the Pragmatic Sanction. This could have become a feeding frenzy of revolts in the Habsburg Empire of Austria, but somehow Maria Theresa, the Habsburg Empress of Austria, the mother of Joseph II, was able to hold her empire together. She was able to hold her empire together by granting new privileges to the nobility, and she also gave recognition to Hungary as the most important of her provinces. Now, so Prussia seizes Austrian territory. France smells blood and jumps in on the side of Prussia, who before had always been her enemy. Not because they liked Prussia, but because they wanted to oppose Austria, and France wanted Austrian territory. Britain joined not because they cared one whit about Maria Theresa or the Pragmatic Sanction, but to oppose France, to keep France from seizing, as it says there, the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. The war ended in stalemate with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, in which only Prussia got to keep Silesia. Yeah. Then occurred the diplomatic revolution, which I did see on your test, which was a series of nations suddenly changing side to suit their own ends and to maintain the balance of power. Britain signed a pact with Prussia to keep foreign troops out of Germany at the Convention of Westminster. France and Austria, who had just been fighting each other in the War of Austrian Succession, signed a defensive alliance. Yeah, I mean, tomorrow's enemy is today's friend. Frederick II initiated hostilities that would lead into a colonial war that became known as the 7 Years' War in Europe and the French and Indian War, which is what that film is about, in the colonies. Frederick II sent his troops into Saxony as another province he wanted to absorb. France and Austria then made a new alliance whose goal was the destruction of Prussia. After this war, Frederick II would become known as Frederick the Great. Britain furnished considerable financial aid to the Prussians. Genius, to keep France tied down in Prussia, its neighbor. And the new Tsar of Russia, Peter III. This is where Peter III actually is winning. He's on the winning side. He's with the British, and he actually gets to the very gates of Berlin. He's about to capture Frederick the Great, but suddenly he remembers, oh yeah, Frederick the Great is my hero, and he withdrew from the war. The Treaty of Hubertusburg ended the European theater of the war, and Frederick came off looking like a genius. Okay, let's learn a name here. Sir William Pitt, Prime Minister of Great Britain during the French and Indian War, and is often given credit for winning the war. And I'm sure you also know Sir William Pitt is the namesake of a wonderful city that makes those nasty, they call them Hanratty sandwiches, where you take two pieces of bread and you put everything but the kitchen sink between them. Yeah, I've never been to Pittsburgh, but I've heard those things are a thing. I mean, fried eggs, burgers, French fries, cheese, of course, uh, other bits and pieces, yeah, into those sandwiches. So, Sir William Pitt is given credit for winning the French and Indian War. One, he pumped large amounts of money into Prussia so that Prussia would keep France tied down at home, defending its borders and not in the colonies. He also sent more than 40,000 regular English troops and colonial troops against the French in Canada. He cooperated on a high level with the colonial leaders, which is something other prime ministers wouldn't do. I mean, the British had no respect for colonials as soldiers, as anything. I mean, they felt that if they didn't live in England then, and they lived in the colonies, that they were somehow subhuman. They lived out in the middle of a wilderness, and that will come full circle in the American Revolution, of course. But this guy, Sir William Pitt, actually cooperated with the colonials, and also Sir William Pitt made it a priority to snatch up, steal French sugar. Sugar, very expensive. And then William Pitt turned around and sold that sugar to finance the war effort. So, between 1755 and 1760, French colonial trade fell by more than 80%. Thank you, British Navy, which meant that the French didn't have money. And also, this French and Indian War was a world war. It was fought, yes, in Europe, yes, in North America. It was also fought in India. And in India, Sir Robert Clive led the British forces to victory at the Battle of Plassey. The Battle of Plassey is rather interesting, Mr. Fuller, because the Battle of Plassey is the last engagement where we see the use of elephants. War elephants. Yeah, when they started turning those cannons on elephants, that turned out not to be a good thing. I mean, when the explosion, the elephants, other direction, trampling whoever was behind them, by the way. Now, never had any such European country ever achieved such a major worldwide victory. The Treaty of Paris of 1763. Into the colonial theater war. But let's look at the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Shall we? Terms. Number one. Two. Um, Three. Four. The middle third of the United States, Louisiana Territory. This, once again, has been called the largest land swap in the history of mankind. I mean, you can see why. The British now own all of North America, with the exception of the southwestern part. France gave up all of India to the British, and Spain gave Florida to the British. And then France gave Louisiana Territory to Spain for helping them. And plus, the French wanted out of the colonial business. William Pitt had been voted out of office. He and George III had quarreled. And the Earl of Bute, the next prime minister, was responsible for these treaty negotiations. And the English, they were the world's only superpower at this point in time. Okay. I think it's time for me to have my own Thanksgiving. And yeah. So, we should be having a test we're on page 6 out of 7. Probably a week, probably the Friday after we return. Yeah, that's probably about good for us. The Friday after we return. It's in December sometime. November 30th is the first day. So December the 4th, something like that. But yeah. And so, yeah, I'll see you then. I'm going to stop sharing now. Happy Thanksgiving. Bye now.